Hello everybody, my name is Slimee and welcome to another Westworld breakdown video. Now with this being the finale, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to skip my normal scene by scene breakdown and we're going to kind of just look at the overall picture of the episode and discuss the reveals that we saw in addition to the big moments and what they meant. We'll analyze some of the events a little more deeply, but I'm going to keep this video a little on the short side, in part because I got a lot going on in my personal life this week that's got me wishing there were more hours in the day, and in part because I have more plans for more Westworld videos coming up, and I don't want to bog this down with all of that. Overall, for me, this was a spectacular episode. It was paced just right, with Jonathan Nolan back in the director's chair for the first episode since the pilot, and I honestly think he really hit it out of the park with this episode. We got a lot of the answers to questions we've been asking all season. I would say that Bad Robot Studios has gotten a lot better at tying up loose ends at the end of the season. Lost. And instead of being left with an awful cliffhanger, we got more of a perfect setup for a second season that's going to have everyone eagerly awaiting 2018. Without a doubt, too, stellar performances by Anthony Hopkins, Jeffrey Wright, Tandy Newton, Evan Rachel Wood, Ed Harris, Jimmy Simpson, Ben Barnes, and James Marsden. This show is definitely going to be a monster at the Emmys and the Golden Globes this year, too. Now, first and foremost, we find out that William is, in fact, the Man in Black. I think most of us have been assuming that for some time now based on the physical similarities of the characters, but even up until last week, I was still only 90% sure, with that 10% nagging feeling that it might be Logan. I was kind of bummed to see Logan go out the way he did, and I really enjoyed his character, but by the end of things, we see the tables flipped and find out that William is the unstable one, and that Logan's actually a pretty normal and likable dude. We also find out that the company they work for is Delos, which is the company that owns the park in the present day. Since we never saw the inside of the Mesa complex aside from the arrivals in the dressing room in William's timeline, we never even knew that Delos didn't get involved until several years after the park had opened. So even with all the theorizing and sleuthing, there were still some awesome reveals that I don't think most people had even been theorizing on, which is kind of awesome. We also got to see William's transformation into the Man in Black, and it's all rather heartbreaking when he finds Dolores again and she doesn't recognize him. That's when we see him don his hat, change his attitude towards Westworld, and go on a massive killing spree. We also see the twisted side of William as he tortures and slaughters hosts in front of Logan, who seems to be truly disturbed by what he's seeing. And I'm honestly surprised that William still married Logan's sister after the events that unfolded, and I wonder if we'll find out more about that next season. The next big reveal is that Dolores is indeed Wyatt, and that the Wyatt narrative is actually 35 years old. Arnold merged the character with Dolores and had her kill all the hosts inside the park alongside Teddy before having her execute him and Teddy using the command, "These violent delights have violent ends." I think it's really interesting that the Wyatt narrative was that old and that the park decided to abandon it, and then Ford decided to come back to it all those years later, and then, as we found out at the end of the episode, the reason we came back to all that was because he was essentially retracing the steps of Arnold to prove that these hosts could achieve consciousness. We also find out that the maze is just a child's toy used to represent the path to consciousness, and finding the center of the maze is a path for the host to take towards true consciousness through a series of steps as opposed to an actual maze. William is extremely frustrated to find out that what he's been chasing all season was nothing more than a child's plaything, and when he tries to take that anger out on Dolores, she goes all Terminator on him and kicks ass and breaks his arm. Before she can kill him, though, he manages to get her with a knife before Teddy shows up to stop him and save her. In our other major storyline, we find Maeve rebuilt without the explosive device implanted in her, and the changes she makes to Hector and Armistice to help her escape. They find Bernard, fix him up, and he reveals to her that her idea for escaping is actually part of her own new narrative, and he even shows her all the steps she's already taken and is supposed to take, but the last being mainland infiltration. He tells her that even now, no choice she has made has been her own, but that she has woken up before, as has he. Right before she boards the train, Felix gives her a slip of paper with information about her daughter, and while Maeve sits on the train, she sees a little girl, and then in a brilliant twist, she makes her own decision out of free will to get off the train and find her daughter. So, despite the entire season, it seeming like she was achieving consciousness and then finding out that she was still on a loop, it was neat to see her actually make a free will decision at the end of all of that. We also got our first glimpse into what other parks there might be in the show, as during the Maeve escape, they crossed into the area marked SW, which is likely short for Shogun World or Samurai World. There's all kinds of samurai hosts around, and it'll be interesting to see when we'll visit that park and what we'll get to see in there. I've always loved feudal Japan, so I'm really excited to visit it in the Westworld sense. I do think it was more of a teaser than a preview of Season 2, however. I think there's still some more stuff to play out in the Wild West, and I think Samurai World will be introduced at some point either later in the season or not until Season 3. It also makes me wonder whether there's any other worlds, as we know from the original film that there were 2 other worlds besides Westworld, that being Roman World and Medieval World. When Teddy and Dolores make it to where the sea meets the mountains, she dies in his arms, and we find out that this is actually just the introduction of one of Ford's new narratives. A bunch of lights come on, there's a celebration at Escalante with all the members of the board there and some VIPs. Ford has Dolores taken to Arnold's old lab where Bernard shows up as well, and it really seems like Ford was actually expecting him to show up. And then we had this emotional moment as Ford explained who Bernard was to Dolores and how he's had to keep them separated all these years to prevent any reverie issues. And in so many words, Ford tells Dolores and Bernard that Arnold had actually failed, and when Dolores killed Arnold, she did it under Arnold's command. 35 years later, Ford realizes that Arnold was right and that he's trying to correct his mistakes, and we find he's actually been trying to finish Arnold's work this entire season, trying to push Dolores on the path to consciousness. Ford and Bernard leave Dolores downstairs and exit, and we have this heartfelt moment between Bernard and Ford where Ford reveals that this is what he's actually been doing, trying to finish Arnold's work, and that he once again tells Bernard, "Goodbye, old friend," before shaking his hand. It would appear that this is a transference of power, as the only other person in the entire facility that's aware of Bernard being a host is Felix, and Bernard, like Dolores, is now self-aware and can make decisions on his own, making him a pretty good candidate to replace Ford. Ford then gives a big retirement speech in front of all the guests where he reveals he has just one more narrative to introduce, a story about a person named Wyatt. We then see Dolores come behind Ford, pull out a revolver, and shoot him in the back of the head as he finishes his speech. Unlike with Arnold, this time, Dolores' decision to kill is by choice, not by programming, and Ford was hoping she'd choose this option. Ford even says in episode 1, when talking about how far they've come in terms of evolution, and even in how far they've come in developing these hosts, it means we're done. This is as good as we're gonna get. For Ford, he's reached his peak. There's nothing left for him to do in this world. I honestly don't think Hopkins will be back for season 2, and I think this was a fitting goodbye to the character of Robert Ford, and that we'll see traces of him in future seasons come to life in his code, as he explained how dead composers lived on through their music. While I do think it's possible that it could have been a host Ford that was killed or a host Ford to replace the dead Ford, I think something like that really cheapens the effect of death. There can't be host versions of everybody, and as much as we'll all miss Anthony Hopkins, I think his death and his end was extremely poetic, and to come back after the show, after this, would ruin that poetry. After Dolores kills Ford, she turns the gun on the rest of the guests present and just starts firing at random, and it's absolutely glorious. Teddy seems stunned, and Rebus, good old Trevor, a smile across his face, loved every split second of that unfolding. Lastly, as Lee Sizemore goes to get Peter Abernathy out of cold storage, he finds the entire storage area empty, and that the hosts have been turned loose at Escalante. We see Clementine fire a real rifle at William, hitting him in his good arm. Instead of pain and fear, though, William smiles, having finally got what he wanted. Hosts that can fight back, as if Ford was rewarding him for his 30 years of adventuring in the park and saving the park, quite frankly. I think there's something really symbolic, too, about the role reversals as well. Ford starts off this show treating the hosts like inanimate objects with no feeling, and William falls in love with one. But by the end of things, Ford is the one who is sympathetic to the host's plight, and William feels no emotions toward them whatsoever. And I think that's where I'm going to end this video. I'm very sad that Westworld is wrapped up for the time being, but honestly, I've not been so thrilled with a season finale in a very long time. While next season is a long way off, I think we'll all survive the wait without too much suffering. Now, like I said, this isn't the last Westworld content for me. In the coming weeks, I'll be doing some more videos going over various themes and symbolism in the show and the breadcrumb clues laid out throughout the series that led to all these big reveals, as well as a video breaking down some of the unanswered questions and some predictions for Season 2. I'll also be doing a video that sort of summarizes the entire first season as well. Be sure to like this video, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe for some more content. With more than 60 pages of notes on the first season, I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have about the events that occurred in this season down in the comments section below. So until next week, guys, may you rest in a deep and dreamless slumber.